As you heard in the previous episode, I initially sat down with Jackie Hoffart to discuss their work in comedy. Our conversation took a different direction that I unfortunately didn't dig into more at the time, but during that interview, Jackie briefly mentions how they address the intersections of fatness and gender in their stand-up routines. After we finished recording, Jackie opened up about exploring their gender as a fat person and the unique considerations they faced as they considered undergoing top surgery. For example, how might removing body fat help achieve a particular gender identity or presentation? And how are we supposed to feel about that when we also identify as fat positive, or at the very least, are invested in body neutrality? I invited Jackie back for a second interview so we could dig deeper into this discussion.
I'm Jackie. I'm just debuting they pronouns only, so I use they pronouns. And I'm a comedian and comedy producer in Vancouver, and also a writer of sorts. And what else do I do? I have cats.
Cool.
Yeah.
Love that. I mean, I identify as Millie's mom first and foremost, and
Right?
That's my dog. So,
Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited to have you here, Jackie, because I interviewed you last season about your work in comedy and your comedy show, and we had some really interesting things come up in the conversation that I took note of, and then when I was transcribing the interview, had really wished we had gone down that path instead. I think that you brought up some really complicated but very important talking points about gender and fatness and gender-affirming surgeries and fatness that I'm very grateful to be teasing apart with you in season 2. And this is definitely a less straightforward topic. You know, I'm not just going to be asking you, how did you start your comedy show and where did it go from there? This is going to be, I think, really tricky and messy. And I appreciate that we can have that conversation today. And to get started, in that first interview, I think what flagged this for me is my first question was, do you identify as fat? What's your relationship with the word fat? And in your response, I had this moment where I was like, oh my goodness, I actually don't know if Jackie identifies as fat, and I might have made a big mistake here and kind of spiraled a little bit. And so I kind of want to start back there and sort of set the parameters or lay the foundation for what we're talking about. So can you tell me a little bit about identifying with the word fat, how you identify with that word, or how it might inform your positionalities and experience?
Definitely. So I do identify as fat. It obviously depends on the context in terms of when I roll that out. But for me, the first time that I sort of, I feel like fat is this kind of like destination that you circle around for a long time before you actually land at. And so the first time I kind of made a pass through it was actually when a good friend, invited me to Fat Club Vancouver, the Facebook group. And I remember thinking, right, sure, okay. And then being quite grateful because it was like a really interesting space and a good resource, and like there were lots of interesting people on there, and it sort of fit my politics and all of that. So I remember thinking, oh, I need to develop some consciousness here around what I come to that word with, but also, my experience in this body, in this world. And I think I don't have a maybe unique experience, but I definitely did grow up with like a very fat phobic mother, in the sense of my mom was always going to Weight Watchers and always dieting, and always I think I even joined her at Weight Watchers at a young age, like maybe 12 or something like that. Just there was always consciousness of trying to be smaller. And also when I was I mean, just my physical growth as a human, or even puberty, or like puberty the first time, as I like to call it, because there may be more, is I had a massive growth spurt when I was like 10 or 11. Like I just grew in a really short period of time till my adult height, basically. And so for a long time, I remember being referred to or overhearing a teacher once call me that big girl. Mm-hmm. And like, you know, it just isn't, I mean, I was tall, but also like, I don't know. It's also so hard for me to look back and think, especially now as I'm the fattest I've ever been, to think of how fat I've always felt in some ways because mm-hmm. of cultural conditioning and social conditioning, and looking back to see how, I mean, I kind of not really true that was in some ways, and how, you know, how much of that sort of torture and self-torture and societal torture sort of played out for me. But yeah, I sort of came to it slowly, much like my own sort of experience with my weight has, I think, been really situationally exacerbated. So I had a car accident like maybe 10 years ago that limited some of the mobility in my back, and I've always also been the kind of person, maybe this is like a white sort of sometimes woman identifying thing to do. I don't know. I'm trying to process this on my own a little bit, but I've always like used whatever excuse was available to me to not do physical exercise. And so when I was like little, I had this like, because of this growth spurt, I had this like weird, there's actually like a syndrome associated with it. And so I was like, oh, I can't do the long distance running because I'm going to break my knee. And, which is like a thing that can happen, but it's very rare with mm-hmm. the condition. Mm-hmm. Anyway, you know, but like, yeah. And then, I hurt my back and I was like, oh, I can't do Pilates because it hurts too much or whatever. And I can't do anything. I just engage in regular movement. And then, yeah. And then I think, you know, especially over the pandemic and also just my relationship with like smoking weed and eating a lot and like surviving a pandemic, and the sort of confluence of the three of those things, and like lack of movement. I'm just not a person who's where like a lot of movement and a lot of physical activity has been part of my life in a big way. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it has a bit of a toll for me, or toll's maybe not the right word, but it has an effect. And so, you know, I've had to sort of wise up a bit to learn about the conditioning that I've gone through around fatness and how it's anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. Yeah, and how, you know, it certainly doesn't even necessarily affect me the worst, and how, you know, there's like different sort of subgenres of fat or of fat identifying folks or bodies, and really kind of humble myself a little bit in those ways. But I don't really claim to be any kind of expert. I'm just navigating things. Mm-hmm. But part of the reason why I said it depends where I am is because, particularly in comedy, I would say it's one of the last places where it's still pretty normal to make fat jokes, and they mm-hmm. definitely still get laughter from the audience, even though I can appreciate, or I expect that a lot of the time that's awkward laughter, or the kind of laughter that comes from being uncomfortable, mm-hmm. which I'll say a lot of comedians sometimes confuse with thinking that they're funny. But yeah, sometimes people just laugh because they're uncomfortable. And but anyway, so sometimes I can acknowledge fatness or my own body or my fat body on stage, and it'll create not a problem, but like a kind of new set of terrain to navigate, mm-hmm. like in the room, because like no one wants to laugh then, but then also nobody wants to, like everybody wants to be in on the joke, but then it's not, you have to be very careful that you're not making fun of yourself, or if you are, like, you have to be very deft about how you're doing it in a way I find that can be human or that can be real, but it isn't necessarily making fun of fatness or fat mm-hmm. people. Yeah.
I think that shift from I mean, and of course, when we're children, we don't have as sophisticated language or understanding. And so we talk about things more as a feeling. And so shifting from primarily feeling fat and navigating that to being introduced to more of a fat politic, and then trying to frame or situate your feelings as a political identity where you can take up space, where you can't take up space, is such an interesting, like, come to Jesus moment, I think, for a lot of us, because we don't necessarily leave those feelings behind.
Yeah.
We carry them with us and try to better understand them and try to problematize them sometimes, because it is, for a lot of folks, problematic to quote unquote feel fat. But at the same time, all of us know exactly what we're talking about when we say that. And I think too, what you're saying about being a fat comedian is really interesting, because one of the threads that I picked up on from our initial interview was your joke about Costco and being someone who people want to approach at Costco. And what that signified to me, and what the joke is it's the intertwining of fatness and gender. And so I kind of want to take the opportunity to go down that road a little bit. And perhaps for context, do you mind telling the joke or just sort of explaining what that was about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even, I'm like flattered that you would consider it a joke. I feel like I feel like there's a lot of my comedy is just little stories that I've strung together. Whatever, maybe that's comedy, but
I think I just identified with it. I was like, yeah, same.
yeah. I mean, I've been thinking, let me shift a little bit. I became aware at some point that people used to think of me as like intimidating or even like bitchy. And then the more I'm read or coded culturally as fat, I think softer my vibe is somehow, which I think contributes to things like people asking me for directions or people asking me which tea towel they think they should buy at Costco, which is related to the joke that I told. Somebody complimenting me on my shoes, like, you know, this kind of, this approachability, this kind of being viewed as not a threat. I think just on a sort of animal-like level is something, I don't know, I guess I regret a little bit. It makes you feel a little less powerful, maybe on a sort of animalistic level, that I'm not that I sort of desire to be intimidating or violent in any way, but that the sort of noticing the loss of those privileges ultimately is something that I've discovered recently, and or has occurred to me, I think, from time to time. And yeah, that's hard. That's complicated stuff to try to get through in like 20 seconds on stage. But people, yeah, I think people, I mean, people can understand. So it's funny for me that the joke resonated for you so much, because particularly because of that angle isn't even really something I sort of consciously wove in there. It's more like something that you identified with, but maybe I didn't consciously weave that thread in there. It's just there. So in the sense that like being approached in Costco like all that happened was that somebody just assumed I would have a preference for which tea towel they should buy, and just like cold called me as I was walking down the aisle. And so I chose and kept going, but like, you know, and then I guess the joke there is that like I'm sort of attractive to Costcoites, you know, like that there's something about me that's like, I'm Costco hot, I think is the joke. And you know, and I think there is something there that leans into kind of like, oh, Costco is sort of bulk, large, homey, it's sort of unsexy, right? It's these sort of tropes that where a body like mine isn't so unusual to see in a Costco, maybe. But like with cute shoes and a nice jacket, like suddenly we change things up a little bit, but not that the script is still ultimately, you know, about these basic facts.
Yeah. Well, I think that fatness and gender interlock in many ways that can be teased apart, even just in that joke or in that visual. You know, fatness is, like you've said, sort of makes you less threatening, and so does being read as a woman makes you less threatening. You know, if you're a kid and you're lost in Costco, you're probably going to look for someone who could be a mom compared to anyone else. And one of the things that we started to talk about in our last interview was how that these interlocking topics or things between fatness and gender also make it much more complicated when you're trying to sort out for yourself what your desired gender identity or presentation is or could be. And so one of the roads we started to go down was your consideration of having top surgery and what that involved as a fat person, because it is inherently different than someone who is thinking of undergoing it who is not fat.
Totally.
So can you talk a little bit about that thought process, or how all of these different feelings about how you might be read in public spaces, and then also your own, like all of us, sort of tumultuous relationship with your own body, how that has informed that aspect of your life, or I guess sort of also update us as where you're at with that now too.
Yeah. There's a lot in there.
It's like 4 questions in one. So maybe we'll just start with like, how has your gender identity rubbed up against your relationship with fatness?
So it's funny. I'm going to give you the weirdest answer. When I was in grade 6, I remember my grade 6 teacher, Mr. Jensen, was like, he had, I guess, what you would call now a dad bod. And by that, I mean, he had a little bit of a paunch or some sort of belly. I wouldn't call him fat, to be honest, but he definitely had a belly. And I remember him having his, like wearing his, polo shirts or whatever tucked into his pants. And I remember being in grade 6 and thinking a woman could never get away with that. But sort of underneath that, there was a little bit of a kernel of like, I want to be able to get away with that. Like, I want to be able to tuck my shirt in and stand in front of a classroom or whatever, and just have it be normal or nothing. And so for me, I think when I think of fatness and gender, I think a little bit about how, I don't have any real lived experience in a male body or in a male coded experience, although I frequently do have some experiences like that in washrooms. But I have to assume that men just don't face the same kind of public pressure and societal pressure. They certainly do, but like on a different scale or perhaps a different intensity than women do, or than people understood to be women do.
I feel like that intersects with queerness too, because I wonder, and I don't, this is more of a question than speaking for you, but in grade 6 too, I mean, the aesthetic of our young queerness was very much polo shirts and Bermuda shorts, right? And so there's also this, a good woman, a straight woman, would not be able to get away with wearing a polo shirt. And then you have the added layer of fatness. And when you just mentioned the bathrooms, I think that's speaking to a very specific form of fat queer body as well, where your gender is put into question. And in part, that is because of your queer aesthetic of having a shorter haircut, of coming across as more mask of center or what have you, but still not fully being in that other camp. And so you're existing in this gray area that makes people uncomfortable. And that is related to fatness, queerness, gender in this really tricky way, this like trifecta that just sort of comes together to code your body and then not code your body as legible.
Yeah, and I think too, particularly as both my breasts and my belly have changed shape over the decades. I'm 41 now. I'll be 42 soon. That's a lot of change, and it's also a lot of change in how I sort of am read and perceived, and I think you're right. I think There's another comic, a fat comic, who, again, I don't know if she's fat identified, but I love her comedy. But she had a joke about making sure her tummy was smaller than her breasts, right? Like that the line, that there's like this boob line, and even though that's not my joke, I could relate to it. And then now, as a person who, sort of my journey to having chest surgery is that I had long had the idea, but wanted to have a kid, and then breastfeed in theory. And then, sort of situations in life and all sorts of things came together to sort of not make that a reality. And so I closed the door on that in terms of my body. And then as soon as that happened, it opened the door then for me to have chest surgery. And so I've been in I think now 2-year-long process, basically trying to kind of get this surgery. And we're like 1 to 2. And over that time, obviously, like sort of anticipating such a radical change to my body. And dear listener at home, if you're not watching this on YouTube or on Sweet Sweet TELUS Optic, I have large breasts. Like I have giant. I don't know what size they are, but they're huge. And so it's a radical surgery for me, and it'll change obviously my weight, but it'll change my body pretty significantly. And while I won't necessarily become my grade 6 teacher like overnight, I think it's going to make those situations in the bathroom a lot harder for me if I decide that I still want to use women's washrooms. Like I think it's going to make that even more stressful, just because I know for a fact that I tend to push my breasts out when I feel the vibe of being sort of like, what are you doing here? So there's those kinds of things, which on some level, I mean, I don't know, is that just intro to top surgery? I don't know, but like part of me is sort of like, I think about that. I think about that a lot. And then there's also, I don't feel like I'm betraying my body by having chest surgery in any kind of way, or betraying my fatness even, because I certainly will still be fat once my breasts are removed. But I don't know. I almost feel like I'm just like tiptoeing along a trail that I don't know where it goes, and whether or not I have a transition or not, like a full sort of gender swap, as it were. I don't know, but that too will greatly shift my body and my body dynamics and the way my body is ran, obviously in a huge way. And I've done some reading of trans men's experiences in the world, and certainly I think taking testosterone like really can gender you in certain ways, certain really specific ways, that also I think rub against fatness. And which is not to say, I mean, obviously there's plenty of fat men in the world, but I mean, there's not a lot of trans fat representation out there.
It's so true. I think that, I mean, especially 10 years ago, when friends of mine were going through different types of transitions, YouTube was really sort of the place that they went. And I remember thinking there's only one type of trans masculinity being represented, and they are never fat.
Yeah.
And I think that joke that you mentioned from that other comedian about there being like a breast line, that resonates with me so much, because I think for quite a few of us who are assigned female at birth, might be familiar with sort of that unnecessary, invisible line. And I've had conversations with a friend of mine who's had chest surgery. And one of the things that they said to me was, I wasn't prepared for being able to see my belly in this way, or how I didn't realize how large my belly was until I had top surgery. And I remember thinking, because I've considered top surgery for myself. And it's interesting because one of the things that keeps me from seriously entertaining the idea is, well, what if I have children one day? And I just have a hard time with commitment in general. And then taking anything off the table is scary. So I just sort of scream about it internally and then just don't think about it. But one of the things, this interesting part of this conversation with this friend of mine was that I started to think about whether or not I was considering top surgery because it was this socially acceptable form of liposuction, basically. Yeah. And I think that for a lot of us, we have that fantasy, especially if our bellies are going past that breast line, we think about having some kind of fat removal procedure. Yeah. And so already fat people are quite limited in the access they have to exploring their gender identity, because fat stigma just makes everything harder for us, or it takes so many things off the table. But then when it involves procedures that also involve removing fat from the body, when you have a very strong fat politic, or at least are adjacent to those communities, it can make thinking about those things even harder as you consider gender affirming surgery. And we have kind of already acknowledged that in some ways it is a fat removal procedure. How has that, as you try to mitigate like your fat politic with your gender presentation and gender identity, what is that thought process like?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Another way to frame the question too, I guess, is how has being fat informed that process?
Right. Well, so I would start off by saying, I joined a Facebook group where people talk about this, but it's mostly just like a sort of trans, but like assigned female at birth, largely like group on Facebook. And it's a lot of people just sharing support around chest surgery. And so there was lots of sort of ability to research things and talk about things. And there definitely are fat people on there with like fat politics, but then there's also tons of people on there who are like, okay, my surgery's in 6 months and I'm going to do a lot of dieting and I'm going to do a lot of like weight loss before then. And does anybody want to, join me? And so there's like kind of all of that to navigate. And then there's fear. I think it might've been my GP who said something, who kind of warned me in I would say nice way, that I might run into some trouble around, anesthesiologists and BMI and that kind of stuff, because obviously I have to go under for the surgery. Never had a surgery before. So, but when I had my surgical consult with the surgeon herself, I was so nervous. Like I just didn't want this. I mean, I don't actually think that chest surgery will, fix my gender. I just think it's a sort of step in the direction that feels right for me. And so that's the sort of the most I can say for it. So my surgeon was sort of like, oh, I actually consider it unethical to not operate on larger people, or whatever her language was. And I was kind of like, well, why is that an issue? Like, why does that sometimes come up? And she said, oh, it's because the surgery just takes longer. And I think it's unethical for surgeons not to do that because it's a longer surgery.
That fat tax well, it's a more difficult procedure because it's either time consuming or I need to take this extra step to make it safe, which, when I'm teaching, if I have a student who takes a little longer to grasp a concept, I don't charge more for that. That's part of my job. But it's so interesting to me that when it comes to operating on fat people, that that seems to be a valid point of contention, or even a justifiable reason for someone to deny someone health care.
Yeah. Well, and then on top of it, so, ultimately the surgeon was kind of like, yeah, it's no problem. And I was so relieved. And then she was sort of like, once I remove the breast, there's these sort of bands that come around the side of your body and into your back a little bit that will kind of remain there, or there'll be sort of some excess tissue. And so when I sort of close you back up, there'll be these little they're sort of uncharitably called flaps or like wings. Sometimes people get a little bit, it's particular to people who've had chest surgery, that there's especially fatter people. And I find it challenging to find photos of this because a lot of, like, as you can imagine, there's lots of people out there sharing photos, especially in this Facebook group of their healing process and their scars and things like that. But it's fewer fat people.
Interesting.
And it could be that fewer fat people are getting surgeries, and so as a result, there's fewer pictures. But I have a feeling there's more at play. But anyhow, the surgeon was like, it'll be $1,200 extra to remove these sort of, I don't know, flaps or whatever, if you want. But, in that moment I was kind of like, okay, I don't have $1,200, so yeah. I guess I won't be doing that. But then, part of me was like, oh, do I fundraise for this? And do I ask my parents? And I'm not sure. And all of this kind of stuff. Like, I'm still not sure what to do. She sort of insinuated that they're not like that. I can sort of take a long time to pay it back, which I was like, okay, thanks. But part of me is sort of like, how does this ethical stance not include like whatever you need to do to have the surgery to make a person sort of
like to complete the surgery, if there's this additional step or what have you.
Yeah, it's sort of like, it feels like it's incomplete, or it feels like, I'll be sort of punished for not for having a fatter body, or for not having enough money to also have something deemed marginally optional as a component of my non-optional gender-affirming surgery. It just feels a little bit funny to me, not in a good way. And so I'm navigating that, but I still don't know what I'll do, because of course I don't have the money. And also, but there's part of me that's like, oh, I could probably ask my community. And like, as much as I'm kind of like, I don't love the idea of fundraisers for white people, like I think people can contribute or not based on what they want to do. And I can put it out there and feel okay about that. I think that's all right. But like, there's just always going to be something. I don't know. It just feels like,
yeah, it can feel kind of like we don't get to have nice things, and that when a nice thing might be extended to us, that there's conditions, or it falls just short of being a nice thing. Yeah. When you framed it as feeling like a punishment for being fat, that like hit me. Like I physically felt that, and I think that feeling of being punished and paying these fat taxes is applicable to so many different things, but it feels so especially jarring when it's being applied to something like gender affirming surgeries. And I think too that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the fat experience, especially in childhood and adolescence, is that sometimes we internalize fat stigma and feel like we deserve to be punished. We deserve to be in pain. We deserve to be uncomfortable. We shouldn't get to be comfortable sitting in chairs because of our fat bodies and what have you. And it's profoundly painful to think about how, as you move throughout your life and as you work hard or begin to confront that myth that is so deeply ingrained in us and literally painful, that there are still things you're going to come up against that bring up those feelings of being punished. And I mean, how do you navigate that? How do you, as you're saying, it's very layered because of other things like financial inaccessibilities and barriers and things like that. But can you talk a bit more about how you feel, or what your thought process is right now about what you might do, or how you feel? Like, what would your ideal scenario be, do you think? Would it be to remove those things and have that add on to your procedure?
Well, it's it's liposuction. Like, that's literally what it is. And so for me, I was kind of like, oh, that's like a crime. Like, you can't, or that's like, but then a lot of people find it gender affirming. And I mean, I think in this context where we're talking about gender affirming surgery and having that also be considered healthcare, which it is here, I feel lucky in a lot of ways to be able to access this at all. And then in other ways, I feel like I'm getting, like version 2.0 of something that probably will become more sophisticated in another 10 years or another 20 years in terms of the way we support people through this sort of change. But I wanted to go back to something we said earlier. I just thought of finishing a thought up, which was, I think when there was a friend that I told that I was like, I'm doing it. I'm in the system now. Like, I'm having chest surgery, and her reaction right away was like, oh, you're going to need all new shirts. Or like, she's like, you're going to feel really different in your shirts. And my immediate reaction to that was like, oh no, but I've still got my belly. Like, I was like, maybe, like, sure, there will be some difference in the way I wear clothes, but like only one component of my body is changing, not all of it, and not even all of what's relevant to shirts. and I think, so much of the focus of chest surgery is around the breasts, because obviously that's what that is. But I think when I think of chest surgery, I spend a lot of time thinking about what my body is going to feel like breastless. And like, I mean, for me, the hope is that I can stand a little taller. That is ultimately kind of my hope, I think, for this surgery, is just the feeling of being able to, stand tall and maybe feel a little bit more confident in myself and a little bit more right, I guess. But, I'm sure there'll be a whole new set of problems that will unravel themselves in front of me as that happens. But, it does feel like a big gamble in some ways. And it's also like, there's also something kind of, I don't know. I mean, you can't sort of escape the fact that it does feel optional, like in the sense that like, I don't think that I will pass away if for some reason I'm unable to get this surgery, like, I think this is where kind of surgical interventions become a tricky topic. I mean, I think there's some people who have stronger or more, a lot more urgent dysphoria than I do. And like, my feeling is that that's kind of why I enjoy non-binariness as a space, because it feels a little bit less rigid in terms of what's expected of me and my body. And so in that way, I look forward to being a sort of hybrid body. But I think, what are some other things that I've been feeling? Like, I've felt like, this is something that was interesting in the surgery that came up, or in the surgical consult that came up, is she was like, so, everything or just reduction? And I was kind of like, are those the only two options? Because I was curious whether or not there's like I guess for a while I had thought about, and I had a joke about, kind of a joke, about whether or not it would be more appropriate for me to get like moobs, like as in like, do I want a male body that looks like the type of body that a 41-year-old would have with the rest of the way that my body looks? And I think that actually is possible, but that's not what this surgeon does. It's sort of like we clear cut, or we do the take a little off,
Right.
and there's not really much in between.
I feel like fatness inherently positions you as a hybrid body. And part of that is that fat bodies are different. And I think for some folks who, at least from conversations I've had with friends who have larger bodies and who have navigated these consults, the surgeons seem to be trying to preemptively prepare them to be disappointed in their results, almost, where they're like, well, you would look really strange if we removed 100% of everything, or the way fat is being placed on your body, you might not have a completely rigid flat chest, or whatever. For some reason, you might have moves, as you're saying. But then I think also what you said earlier about your wardrobe and how, well, your shirt size might not actually go down, because especially something like a dress shirt, that is also involves a hip measurement and a waist measurement, which would theoretically stay the same. It could even get bigger, right?
Yeah.
And so when we think about how fatness could position the body as a hybrid body, and how it would still require additional steps like unique tailoring to make a dress shirt fit a fat body that no longer has a chest but still has a belly, is a really interesting way to look at it, where in some ways it's quite empowering, because it keeps you, like you're saying, how non-binary does, in this more like queer politic radical space, but then it can also simultaneously maintain the position as other. And you know, which go hand in hand, but are still not necessarily, and it's still not necessarily an easy way or a gentle way to live your life.
I suppose. Although, I don't know, I feel pretty comfortable feeling, I mean, yeah, I've always felt pretty other. So, and like rather comfortable that way, in the sense of, you know, I don't know, I'm a younger sister and or sibling, and I've always been a bit of a goofball and like a little bit outside, and always used comedy to cope in some ways. And I think I think obviously discovering queerness and queer people and queer politics, lowercase q, lowercase p, huge S, is you know, has felt like a large space or a expanse where there's obviously a lot to learn, but also a lot of room for the freaks and the weirdos, and I'm okay with being a freak weirdo. I mean, I suppose it's also a little bit of a scary time to become extra freaky, if I may, politically, but I just kind of can't even with that right now. I'm just sort of like, I'm just going to keep living my life, and we'll just see what happens. But
do you feel, with how difficult it's been to find photos of those flaps, for example, or community that could speak more to your potential experience than others, that you are also in a position which is both exciting and maybe terrifying, where you have to kind of carve that path yourself and just kind of see what happens?
a little bit, yeah, a little bit. I think that's accurate. I mean, I think, let me put it this way. I haven't been exposed to anybody the majority of the people that I know who've had chest surgery in recent years are people who I know sort of tangentially, mostly through social media. And so inevitably I get this distorted view of what it's like, what their experiences have been like. But the overwhelming sort of vibe is a lot of euphoria. Like, there's definitely been a lot of wish I'd done this earlier, you know, I feel great, like I cried, you know, all of these kind of joyful, euphoric experiences. So like, I'm hoping for that, but I'm not expecting it. I think that there'll be you know, shocks and bumps along the way, and a lot of physio ultimately, and like a lot of things that I hadn't or couldn't have thought of, or just didn't know to think about, that will come my way, and I'm sort of softly aware of that. But I still think I don't have like a totally neat, completely coherent approach or opinion about the fact that there is an element of, you know, I mean, I took a class in 18 million years ago in women's studies at UBC that was called Women in the Body. And it was like, yeah, we had to have really interesting conversations around feminism and body modification surgeries and all of that kind of stuff. And it was important for me to realize that like just to be less judgmental, I think in general about everyone and how they're sort of coping in the world, and what people have access to and what they want to do with their bodies is ultimately their own business.
Can I ask you then, is there any hesitancy to remove fat from your body? Like in some ways, does having conversations about reduction, liposuction, all of the language around this, in some ways, does it feel good?
It's a great question. I mean, yeah, I think so. Even though ultimately, like, I think if you were to sort of just throw $1,200 on the table and say, here, get your flaps taken off, I would take it. Mostly because it's hard to imagine a body that doesn't look like anything I can imagine or haven't seen much of. It doesn't sound like exciting to have.
I feel like it's not framed as a valid option either when a surgeon is like, you should have this add-on, it costs extra. Instead of being like, some people don't do it.
It's not fries. Yeah. It's like, it's like cheese. It's part of the main thing. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely not presented that way. I mean, I have seen some drag performers who've had chest surgery who I think probably do have something that you might call flaps. And I think there's ways for it to look cool and sexy. Like, I think it's possible to live in my, I don't know, Franken body and feel empowered. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'll find out.
I feel like for me, when I've thought about my own gender presentation and gender identity, and I've thought about what it means to be non-binary or androgynous or what have you, so often it felt like how we've sort of culturally defined those things was out of reach for me because they were inherently anti-fat. And I wondered, like, do you feel entitled to this non-binary identity? Do you feel entitled to like taking control, I guess, of how you're presenting to the world and then how you might be read? And do you feel like you can achieve that?
That's a great question. I mean, when it comes to identifying as non-binary, it's pretty fresh for me. I started using, like, I remember getting an email from someone like probably 3 or 4 years ago where in their sign off it had said she and they, and I had just never seen that before, where that someone used both or referred to themselves in both, especially in official correspondence. And I was like, it just sort of exploded something for me, and I was like, oh, I like that, that's cool. So I adopted that, and then I did that for pretty much all of last year, and ultimately found that because of my gender presentation, which is pretty masculine, you can say, I get they'd a lot anyway. And so I think for me that transition is a little easier because I think there's a kind of the mainstream understanding of like a queer non-binary identity is, you know, we've basically got like sweat jogging pants suits at the Gap in the non-binary section, you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like, it's like that one actor on Grey's Anatomy, you know, like there's sort of I mean, even they're a little you know, they have long hair, so that could be a little bit revolutionary for a non-binary character in the sense that they're not androgynous or butch kind of looking. or not particularly, I think.
Which makes them palatable too to a mainstream or non-queer viewer, right?
Yeah.
Like you can view it in multiple ways.
Yeah, it's not like Leah Delaria or something like that. Yeah. It's also messed up.
And exhausting. Because you can talk yourself in circles where you're like, I feel entitled to these things. I want to chase it for myself. And then also I'm hitting these barriers that other people don't hit. And that feels like I'm lying to myself, or I have a misconception or whatever. And then also I love this beauty of the Franken body and just kind of being like, who cares?
Yeah.
Where you're like just throwing it to the wind and just, or even sometimes like throwing it to the wall and seeing what sticks and being like, cool, that's what we're going with. Feels very radical and brave and exciting. And I, when you, in your last answer where you said, you know, these are the things that I want for myself, I want those for you too. And I think you deserve them. And I hope that's what happens.
Thank you.
And I hope you also feel supported by community to get those things that you want.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jackie, for chatting with me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
This podcast is produced and directed by me, Layla Cameron. Both audio and video versions of this podcast were edited by Ari Conrad Birch. Each interview was filmed and audio recorded by Rami McHale. Additional video was filmed and edited by Felix Naud and directed by ETW Media Productions. The music for this season is by the band Parlor Panther. Funding for this podcast is supported by TELUS STORYHIVE.